Good evening. From the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle, welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. I'm Mark Bernier, moderator for tonight's event. In cooperation with the Office of Alumni Relations, tonight one of the most talked about issues over the last few years, cybersecurity. What happens to your checking account, to your banking, as a matter of fact, anything that you do online. Who's seeing it, and could it be ever used against you? Just a few of the many questions to be asked of our guest tonight. An interactive experience, and we welcome our YouTube audience as well. You'll be able to submit your questions directly to our guest as well as our assembled audience here at Embry-Riddle. As you know, we're especially proud of the students of Embry-Riddle, those who have graduated and gone on to exciting careers. It's especially thrilling when one of our graduates comes back to talk about the bounties of their education. That's what we're doing tonight. Our special guest is the founder and owner of Total Digital Security, an Embry-Riddle alumnus. Please give a warm welcome for Brad Deflin. Thanks, Mark. Brad, thanks for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
There's some basics that we'll get to and explain to the audience. Even I was learning things today I have never heard before. Let us begin with, what is Moore's Law?
Sure, great start. Moore's Law is really the driver of most of the change that you see today. You know, I myself ask myself, am I just getting old? I mean, things really change quickly. No, things really are changing that quickly because some 50, 60 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Gordon Moore, who went on to found a little company by the name of Intel, perhaps you've heard of it, and some of his peers actually invented the first transistor, semiconductor, first computer on a chip, if you will. Before that, they were full of vacuum tubes, took up the size of a couple of rooms. Now the micro transistor was invented and was beginning to be produced. And a couple of years after manufacturing these chips, a scientific body in the United States said, Dr. Moore, we'd like you to come back and talk to us about what you've learned since you invented these chips and have been manufacturing these chips for a few years. And he said, I'd be delighted to. Let me do some homework and I'll analyze our data and I'll come back and tell you what we found. And when he reported, he said, I'm probably as surprised to say this as you are, but what we're finding is we are able to create chips that are twice as fast as the previous chip we manufactured at half the cost every 1 to 2 years. In other words, twice the output, twice the value, twice the productivity at half the cost. Nobody believed it because we had never seen a value proposition like that before. Today, Moore's Law still exists. Things in digital format progress at 100% every 1 to 2 years at half the cost, and that's why everything is surrounding us in terms of digital technology today.
I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you said something at lunch I found intriguing, that within a very short amount of time, we will have a process that will have twice all the information that's ever been conceived up until that moment in a matter of a short time. It's replicating.
Yes, the data that we create as individuals, as a society globally, Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, actually determined that every day now we are creating as much data as all of humankind created between the beginning of time and the year 2003. You take all the data from the beginning of time to the year 2003, we're creating that much data every single day. And by the time we reach the year 2020, that will be every couple of hours that we create that much data.
So as we give you the backdrop for tonight's program, talk about big data. What is that?
Yes. So very important backdrop, Mark, to everything that we talk about. Big data is very powerful software. Not only have the chips progressed and become very powerful, but so is the software that operates on these computer chips. You're seeing artificial intelligence now being introduced, for example. Big data is a term to know for the future. A lot of people capitalize it, big B, big D, big D. Big B, big D, and you see it in annual reports, every government report. It is software that is able to mine these large silos of data and find, well, what are the common denominators here? How do we connect these dots and mine knowledge from this raw data? So companies are using it to predict consumer behaviors, buying patterns, to help them budget their finances, to do all sorts of things that transcend really our ability as humans and accountants to figure out, mining this data to create knowledge from it.
How many of you have an Alexa or speak to Alexa at Amazon? Okay. It's under the umbrella of the Internet of Things, things that we commonly use every day in our homes. I didn't realize it was as fast, right down to your TVs, your computers, and this thing called Alexa.
Sure. So as these chips are driven by Moore's law and keep getting more and more powerful and cheaper, they're ending up everywhere, right? We hear about appliances like an Alexa or even our microwave, our refrigerator now having chips. Look how many chips are in a brand new automobile delivered from Detroit that is now connected to the internet. They're proliferating, they're everywhere. So chips are now embedded in almost everything that surrounds our daily lives. They're connected to the internet, they're aware, and they're collecting more and more information. By the time we get to 2020, it's predicted something like 20 to 50 billion of these things will be surrounding our everyday life. An example was in the Wall Street Journal not long ago. Johnson & Johnson had to publicly announce their insulin pump was hacked. They're in our pacemakers. They're in almost everything that we do every day.
One of my radio colleagues has sleep apnea, as I do, but his is monitored through a chip, and the settings are changed on his BiPAP machine electronically away from his home. He doesn't go to a doctor, he doesn't go to a pulmonologist and have those settings changed. You made a statement, you've been quoted, and I've watched you at some of your other discussions. The internet risk is being democratized. I believe that's the term. What does that mean?
Sure. So it's been said that the internet democratizes everything it touches, and where most people sort of get that is with knowledge and information. Think about it historically, what an individual had to do to access knowledge and information. For most of our existence, you had to be somebody of wealth or power to have access to knowledge and information. And then, of course, the library systems brought it closer to the common person. But now, anybody with a computer connected to the internet and a couple of keystrokes has access to the world's knowledge and information, which today on the internet probably exceeds even the knowledge and information the President of the United States had just 5 or 10 years ago. So the internet democratizes everything it touches. People that are in the recording industry will tell you that. It's very hard to control the distribution of their product, which might be a song or a movie or something else. Uber is a great example. It democratized the taxi business. Anybody can be a driver. Anybody can be a rider anywhere, anytime. I was in front of a hotel company in Dallas, and I said, who else has another example? And a young lady raised her hand, and she said, the lodging industry. Our industry is being democratized. Anybody can be a hotelier. Anybody can be a guest anywhere, anytime. Airbnb. The internet has democratized cyber risk. Anybody can be a hacker. Anybody can be a victim anywhere, anytime.
Earlier today, how many people have a TV that has a camera and you're always wondering if you're being watched? See, they put their hands up slowly. You told us Vizio was fined by the federal government for apparently not telling people that those things could be activated even when the TV is off?
Correct. Vizio, you may know the brand. They are sold in Costco, for example. Vizio was fined by the state of New Jersey and the FCC for about $2.5 million because even when the TV is off, it's actually recording your conversations.
Wow. You spoke of one other thing, and this is item number 4 in the setup, the digital vault.
Yes.
What is that and what goes into it?
Sure. So I liken the digital vault to a safety deposit box for the digital age, if you will, right? You have that place where just the very special stuff goes. You might not go to it every day, but you know you can always get it when you want it. So we think that certain documents, maybe a tax return, maybe wills and trusts, maybe scans of your passports, for example, shouldn't be on the cloud. There are certain things, and you know them when you see them, that should be in a digital vault, off the cloud, encrypted, and very safe from the outside.
If it sounds like we're moving through this material very quickly, we are, because we want to have room for your questions from our audience watching on YouTube, but also from you present. So start thinking of your question for Brad Deflin. We're going to go to those questions shortly. We have 2 microphones set up for that purpose. You mentioned a book. I think it's called The New Digital Age. It was written by Eric Schmidt.
Right.
There was a significance to that book because of what Eric Schmidt wrote.
Yes. So Eric Schmidt, if you don't know the name, he is the chairman of Alphabet, which is the holding company for Google. So chairman of the board of Google, very powerful individual. Comes from the old school, if you will, of technology. Grew up on Stanford University's campus and actually was one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. Well, when a few 25-year-olds at Google went public and created a multi-billion-dollar company, Wall Street said, you need to have an adult in the room with you guys, right? There's a lot of money at stake, and we need an adult. Well, they brought in Eric Schmidt. So really a spokesperson on many levels. He wrote a book. It's only been a couple of years that it's out, and it's called The New Digital Age, and it really resonated with us because we think a lot in terms of the digital age. And he's talking about, you know, humanity has been through the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the age of agriculture and, of course, the Industrial Revolution. We are really in the first innings, really at the dawn of a brand new era in humankind known as the digital age. And it's going to take a new set of rules and a new set of behaviors and really new sensibilities, altogether new sensibilities, simply for survival, much less success. And he addresses this, I think, very effectively in the book, especially because he does speak to kids, right, and other generations before us who are great as users on these devices, but probably take a lot for granted when it comes to privacy, personal information, and the fact that they're creating a dossier every single day that they're doing all this stuff online that never goes away.
A self-effacing moment. How many have ever either lost their phones or had it quit on them? Yeah, mine did today during a radio broadcast. I got a new phone in about a half an hour, but during that time, I felt unconnected with the world. I said, what if Brad's trying to call me? What if Bill's trying to call me? And I had to get it fixed. And the ordeal of going, and it's not like it was where I thought, well, I'll just pop a new battery in. I got this phone a year ago. Oh no, the way they're made now, you got to get a new phone.
Right.
But this phone, your phone has your pictures, your identity, it has text messaging, it has connections. We've become so reliant on these things. These will be the supercomputers of the future, will they not?
They're really the supercomputers of today. The power that we hold in our hands, any of your smartphones that you have in your hand, exceeds the power of a Cray computer, if you remember, that was multi-millions of dollars, took up, rooms in size, took IT technicians. It's a supercomputer in the palm of your hand. That's Moore's Law, driving that power and affordability. And here's another fact. More people on the planet have one of those than have a toilet.
Wow. Must be interesting in Africa
notice
and
homeless-
sub-Asian countries.
The homeless people,
Yeah.
they may not know where they're going to have their next meal, but they've got a smartphone in the palm of their hand.
I hear a police officer not far from campus today made a comment. He said, these are homeless people, we're going to get them some help. And someone walking by said, how come they all have cell phones?
Right.
And that was interesting. I'm thinking, where does the bill go?
Right,
It was an Obama phone is what they called it. So the whole issue of paying by phone, people aren't writing checks out before. I think my colleague Chris Lambert made that comment today. You have to wonder about, people need to think about digital identity. Dr. Gary Kessler, one of our colleagues who's in the audience tonight, taught me the very beginning of the digital identity. How easy is it for anyone in our audience or watching to lose their digital identity?
It's very easy, and we think preserving your digital autonomy is really the challenge and the struggle for the future. It's very easy to lose a digital identity if you're targeted, and most of us, we're not targeted, but the day is not far off where almost everybody will be targeted because they can be and because they can extract value from that. Can steal an identity, and your best case is tremendous inconvenience. It can be a lot worse, as a matter of fact.
How many in the audience have heard of Equifax? Okay, I may be mispronouncing it. I've heard it both ways, Equifax. Brad, how did that happen?
Yeah. So these sensibilities that we talk about in terms of, the different behaviors and different mindset that's required for survival in the digital age, we have a long way to go. The CEO of Equifax was testifying on Wednesday last week, and when asked if the data, our data, right, was encrypted, he couldn't answer the question. Technology is really not the problem. It's really humans and our ability to adapt and change into this environment. That is not happening, even all the way up into the C-suite, even all the way up into the highest echelons of the government, for that matter. So these things, we need a lot more grassroots. You know, we were talking about increasing awareness for the student body on campus as new students come on, and really beginning to talk about just as being equipped for survival and success in everyday mainstream life.
After listening to you speak at lunch today, I started to think probably 90% of people might be vulnerable for ransomware. And that's where your computer is locked up. They try to find some vulnerability. It's extortion. It's against the law, but it's the Wild West out there, Brad. There's no policing for it.
Yep.
Will that be brought under control in our lifetimes, do you think? Or controlled somehow or limited?
I tend to think that during our lifetimes, this will come under better control, much better control. I think the next 3 to 5 years, it is the Wild West, and data is the new oil. And we all have a lot of wealth of data, and so we are all more and more becoming targets as a result. Ransomware is when your information on your computer is encrypted and it's held from you for a ransom, and you don't get it back until you pay that ransom in Bitcoin. It's the evolution of extortion.
And so if you're not familiar with Bitcoin, you have to become familiar with it, transfer money to Bitcoin value, and pay the ransom? Is that how it works?
And so when we get the incoming phone calls from new customers that have had a ransomware attack, the first thing, it's almost by script, the first thing they do is they call the police. And the police say call the FBI, because it's really the FBI's problem. And so they call the FBI, and the FBI is inundated with these calls, and the FBI asks you, is your information important to you? And most people will say yes, because they're hubbing, to your point, Mark, they're hubbing their lives off these devices. Shopping, browsing, banking, personally, professionally, all aspects of their lives are hubbing off their devices. So they say yes to the FBI. The information's important. The next question from the FBI is your computer important to you? Well, I just paid $3,000 for my new MacBook. Yes, it's important to me. Then pay the ransom. There's no negotiating, there's no getting your data back, and your computer is probably lost in terms of a usable computer unless you pay to get it unencrypted. So that's the best advice. Remember, these are crimes that have no scene of the crime, right? When you think about forensics, the traditional approach does not apply. These are crimes that can't be prevented by fences or borders or gates. You know, I live in a community in Palm Beach where if you're not in a gated community, you live on an island. And you like that because there are only 2 bridges to get on the island. And everybody knows who's coming and going, and you feel kind of safely ensconced there. Those rules don't apply when it comes to cybercrime.
This is a crime. It's extortion, right?
Correct.
Forgive me for morphing into TV Detective Columbo, but excuse me. If it's a crime, how do you know you're going to get your stuff back even if you pay?
It's good business practice for these cyber criminals to make good on their deal because they know you're going to tell your neighbor.
Really?
And they will also come back to you in about 6 months or less and try you again. And they want everybody to know they'll make good on the deal. They don't want your data, they want your money.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have they been able to at all, this is just sort of a branch from that, target if this is coming from particular countries? It has been suspected that countries that wish to harm us, there was a report that came out that said the United States would not be brought to its knees by missiles and planes crashing into buildings, but by bit, and you spoke to that, over the next couple of years, bit by bit, breaking into people, taking their stuff and bringing the economy to its knees that way. Is that the rule of thumb? Is that what's behind some of this?
It is, and I think that there are certain levels of the federal government and military that absolutely do get this. If you listen to the leaders, you can tell they're very serious. James Clapper, before he left the administration in November of 2016, said to Congress in his annual report on the state of security of the nation that the number one risk to the country in terms of economic stability and national security was the cyber threat. And he said it's not cyber Armageddon. That's a big threat, and it's going to happen where some component of the national infrastructure system, call it the electric utility grid, call it the air traffic control system, whatever it is taken down by the North Koreans or some other entity. The greater risk, according to James Clapper and many others that think about this, is what they call the low to moderate attacks, those that we don't read about in the headlines. Those on us, our families, in our homes, our small businesses, our professional practices, in the aggregate, are now the number one risk to economic stability and national security.
A bit on you. You graduated in '81. You didn't just fall into this. You were in you went through aviation, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't you work for like Leland Brothers for 11 years?
Yeah,
or
yes,
something?
I did.
Okay.
You know, so in reflecting, coming out of aviation, being a professional pilot, working in the airline industry, and where I am today and having a private banking career sort of in between that, you know, how does that happen? But I would tell you that, you know, we're all about what happens at the intersection of people, technology, and risk. And I can't think of another profession than flying an airplane where that really happens every day. You're right at the intersection of people, technology, and risk. How do you manage that? How do you respond to the unknown? How do you mitigate the risk? How do you have a plan? What are your redundancy efforts? A lot of that applies. But in the financial services business, where I dealt with the ultra high net worth market, and I was supervising very large businesses and territories, it was around compliance, it was around supervision, and a lot of that had to do with client confidentiality in those records, and I introduced technology into the space. It was in 2012 when I was at JP Morgan that I kind of had an epiphany that cyber risk was being democratized, and the big deal was not going to be necessarily talking to the IT department or the Pentagon about these issues, but was going to be about talking to us as everyday people and parents and heads of household and owners of small businesses about what this was about and how to become more aware and astute and mitigate the risk and preserve digital autonomy.
And so the point to be made here is that it's not just us that don't know everything and could be victims. Even the smartest people make mistakes, and sometimes they're costly. That you've advocated is to get off free email.
Yeah.
And go where?
So we say privatize email, and I'll address that in a second, but we in the United States especially, in this country especially, have come to believe that things really are free on the internet. And really we know better, don't we? There is no free lunch. So we're very willing to sign up for a free Gmail account or AOL account or some of these other free aspects. The other side of that, though, is think about every 25-year-old billionaire you've ever seen. They're giving you something for free on the internet. The founder of Instagram, the founder of Facebook, the founder of Google, right? All these things are free, yet they are multi-billionaires making wealth faster than ever in history, at younger ages than ever, because they are essentially arbitraging their understanding of the value of your information and your lack of understanding or care or forethought about those things. So every time you send a Gmail or a free email, you essentially are losing in a trade to multi-billionaires that are winning that trade every single day.
Let's talk a little bit about passwords. How often, those of you in the audience who update your passwords, do you do it? We try to do it every 6 months, but now the question is your password going to be stolen? So, to offer something to our viewers and participants, what's the latest on passwords?
There is an art and there is a science to passwords. And these are the keys to your kingdom, and they're not going away anytime soon. And so we have to get better at managing our passwords, like they were the keys to the front door of your castle. First of all, the power of math. Understand the power of math. Passwords have to be long, unfortunately. The longer they are, the harder they are to crack. And the way math works, if we have any mathematicians in the audience, at around 14 characters, a password becomes really hard to hack with current software. You need a password that is 14 characters or longer. That's the bad news. And by the way, nobody's brain, no matter how smart you are, is wired to remember very many 14-character passwords. So you're not alone when it comes to that. Now, on the other hand, we've been taught erroneously that it must also be complex, which means uppercase, lowercase, numbers, characters. It really doesn't have to be complex. That's the part we have to unlearn. It has to be long, and it has to be random. If there is a nursery rhyme or something that has words stringed together, you can't use that because it's predictable. But you can invent a phrase, maybe a quote or a piece of a quote or something that's meaningful to you. I was coaching my, at that time, 14-year-old daughter to try to help her with some better password habits. And I said, and she's rolling her eyes at me like any 14-year-old would, especially around cybersecurity and passwords. And I said, Kendall, think of a phrase. And she said, I don't know, Daddy. Mary had a little lamb, is what she said. I said, all right, let's mix that up a little bit. Let's make it Kathy had a big cow. Now, here's a phrase she could remember. Her cue would be Mary had a little lamb. Her spin was Kathy had a big cow. There's a password. Now, what we recommend, though, is using a password manager so that all your other passwords can be longer, more difficult, not even random, just completely random, not even phrases, so that you use your master password as your master key to get into that password manager, and the password manager does the rest with the other 50 accounts that you have.
So there you have it. You've got do you want to put question mark, $sign, does that matter?
Doesn't necessarily help. That's called hashing it up, and you can do that as long as you can remember where you put those. But that can help you make it a little bit longer. Kathy had a big cow, exclamation point, $sign or something.
Show of hands, how many people in our audience store photos and documents in the cloud? Okay, the cloud is really, you say, a computer.
It is. A lot of people still have a hard time grasping what is the cloud. The cloud is just somebody else's computer. It used to be that all of our stuff was under the desk on our computer at home or on your hard disk. Now it's out there on other people's clouds, whether it be the bank's clouds, the department store computers, what have you. You just have a connection to that information now. That's what the cloud is.
You mentioned something about fog computing today. I thought that was a joke. I was afraid to laugh at lunch because I was afraid that it would be out of place. What is that?
It's really what it is. It's implying that this information is becoming more and more ubiquitous and instantly available. And that's what happened. Something happened in 2007 that was really a watershed event. And that was in January when Steve Jobs held up the first ever iPhone. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But he held it up. We didn't know if the Apple was going to have a phone or not. It was a really big deal. So it was the first iPhone, and he pointed to it, and he said, quote unquote, "This changes everything." And he was right. And it wasn't the iPhone, it was the smartphone. It was the fact you could have a supercomputer in the palm of your hand. And he essentially said in so many words, you will be hubbing your lives off of this. Every element of your life, personally and professionally, will be hubbed off of this. So shortly thereafter, marketing companies, that are very astute from a marketing standpoint said, wow, you know what? Consumers don't want to go home and use their computer. They want to use it on the subway, wherever they are, to bank and browse and shop and communicate. So we need to have that information available wherever they are. That is the cloud. Now with fog, it's actually becoming even closer as a result of caching information. I don't want to get too technical, but again, using artificial intelligence, using your sort of historical experience to know what you were inclined to want at any particular time, what photos you're going to access, what accounts, so that it's constantly there, just like this, without even having to go any further to the cloud to get it. It's in the fog, it's in the ether, if you will.
We've given a lot out there. We're going to start taking questions as quickly as possible. If you have a question for Brad, come right down to our microphone. You can ask it. Also, for our YouTube audience that is watching us, your questions, send them to us immediately, and my colleague Alan Pratt will read them so that everybody will be able to hear them, and Brad will be able to answer them. Put those questions in right now. Precious minutes available for you to do that. As we await our first question, though, your quote, cybersecurity is in the first innings of the new digital age.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
What I mean is that I think that cyber risk and cyber crime is really a symptom of something much bigger, and that is humanity's transition to the digital age. Members of the audience might know Nietzsche, and Nietzsche wrote a lot in the late 19th century about humanity's ability to adapt to the industrial age. And he wasn't necessarily an optimist. And in a lot of cases, people would say he predicted World War I. He said if individuals, families, communities, countries, governments don't adapt to the new industrial age, and at that point, something like 80% of the globe's economy was agrarian. So this was a really big deal at the time. That basically those gears are going to chew you up and spit you out unless you adapt. And he also said that unless you provoke others to adapt, because when you come into a new age, everything changes, and you can't draw on your experience or your education necessarily to help you survive and succeed in the new era. So you have to be provoked and stimulated and taught and educated to think differently and to hold yourself accountable or have somebody else hold you accountable to survive and succeed during that change. That's where we are right now. And so the low-hanging fruit is really those that are not adapting fast enough with hackers that just know it, right? They're just further up the curve, if you will, in understanding technology and information and exploiting those that might not understand it as well and taking advantage of that situation. I think eventually the low-hanging fruit and sort of the easy nature of cybercrime, will not be what it is today, but being the early innings, this is what we have.
Okay, and we can take questions at any given point, so feel free to put them through. I'll get the signal to go to Alan, who will read the question. But in the meantime, we want to hear from you. Step up to a microphone. We have microphones set up. You can ask your question directly at Brad, so come right up now. Let's do that. In the meantime, a lot of people think it's the government's job to fix all this.
We hear that a lot.
You spoke of that earlier. I mean,
Yeah.
that's principally why you're in business.
Right.
And having a lot of clients. What role does the government play? They don't act as the Federal Trade Commission. They don't watch this and say, that's inferior, don't use it, or you need to step up. Do they have a role in this?
So you're right, Mark. A lot do say, where's the federal government in this? And they really do blame the government, and many are waiting for the government to fix it for them, which probably isn't the best idea. So the government's, I think, role, they're still trying to figure it out. It's about awareness. It's about education. At the end of Obama's administration last year, his commission on cyber risk recommended that something like 50,000 new cyber practitioners need to be employed between 2016 and 2020. Now notice he didn't use the word computer scientists or programmers or coders. He's talking about cybersecurity practitioners, almost like a plumber or TV repairman for the digital age, to be out there with people that don't have an IT department to help them come up to speed a little bit better. But we're not really seeing any of that put into action. What we are seeing today, I don't think, is near enough. It's more around requiring companies to report when they're breached. Kind of like after the fact, we should be told about it. And that's good information, but it really doesn't help necessarily prevent these things.
Opening comment, Dr. Gary Kessler joins us now tonight. Dr. Kessler.
I actually had a philosophical question with all of these changes. You mentioned Nietzsche and our transition from an agrarian society to industrial society, et cetera, and with Moore's Law, all of these changes are happening at exponential speeds. Right. So with people having to adapt way more quickly than we're used to adapting, and the disparities that we find with digital divides and things like that, can you speak a little bit to how that is going to affect people in the economy?
Yes, yeah, great point, Dr. Kessler. So the question, how does all of this change affect workers and the economy and sort of the broad-based, way that the country works? Profound changes. Artificial intelligence and robotics will change the nature, the complexion of the workforce entirely. I think that Nietzsche and some of the challenges around the industrial age were the concern that machines were going to replace human labor. And in a lot of cases, they did. Machines replaced human labor. With artificial intelligence and in some cases robotics, we're talking about replacing cognitive functioning, our brains, which since that time, the last 150 years, really have not been challenged by technology. We still needed a human to add the element of judgment and add, a greater element than just the machinations or time and motion movements of a machine. So I think it's far underestimated what that impact will be, Dr. Kessler. I think we are tremendously underprepared. But when we think about our youth and we think about coaching and counseling them and how to survive and succeed for the future, you know, if you're thinking about a profession in law, the legal industry in 10 years won't look like anything. In fact, down where we live in South Florida, well, here we are in South Florida almost, just after the hurricane, a law firm came out with a bot that would file your FEMA claim for you. That means basically artificial intelligence interviewing you and asking you the questions and collecting your information to determine if you were eligible for a FEMA claim and filing it on your behalf. How many lawyers is that going to put out of business, for example?
Wow.
That applies to every industry that we have.
Over here, your question. Good evening. Right into the microphone, please. And if you would, tell us your name and what year of study you are here at Embry-Riddle.
I am Ryan Diaz, and I'm a sophomore of electrical engineering. And I had a question just on what is it about the cloud, like the nature of the cloud itself, that makes it so inherently risky to use?
Great question, and I know that that's on the minds of many. So what makes the cloud risky? And you know, when I was a banker, I remember certain words would become bad words at certain points in time, like options. Options were a really bad word one time. Derivatives, you know. But I mean, I know people that grow sugar in the state of Florida, and they'll tell you without options and derivatives, they'd never be able to survive, hedging their commodity prices, right? So the cloud is not a bad word. Cloud is not a risky word. It's taken on that connotation. But the reason it's taken on that connotation is because now what was once yours and you could get your arm around and it was under your desk or it was right there on your laptop is now distributed. Not only is it distributed and under the control and held accountable by somebody other than yourself, but it is also accessible by many other parties. A cloud is not only somebody else's computer that you have access to, it's somebody else's computer that many, many, many other parties have access to. So all of those things increase the vulnerability or the susceptibility of something nefarious happening. But there are clouds that are also very secure.
We're going to come over here in 1 second. Right now, for our worldwide audience, Alan Pratt with a question. Alan?
This is a question from Scott, an alumnus and cybersecurity engineer. He says, Brad, what are your views on host-based antivirus programs? Are they obsolete due to Moore's Law in terms of malware creation?
Okay, so I think I understand the question is hosted antivirus solutions. And the second half of the question, Alan?
That was, are they obsolete due to Moore's Law in terms of malware creation?
Okay. All right, so great. Some of the antivirus companies, you may know the names like Norton, McAfee, some of the ones that you would buy in a box some years ago or come free when you get your internet through the cable company is an example. They've actually said, we're going out of business. We can't defend, our antivirus business cannot defend against these threats. They morph very quickly. There are tens of thousands of new threats every day. And the way that these antivirus systems operate can't stand up against this type of evolution. So now the new version is a hosted version, which we use and we believe in. That is where a third party that's remote, a professional network operations center, for example, does all of the antivirus functioning, all the heavy lifting, not on your device, but someplace else. That's good news because it took a lot of resources from your device. But it's also good news because now you don't have to constantly be checking for updates and making sure. It's like when you leave the house, you have to make sure your home alarm is on and it's set and all the lights are right and everybody's going according to protocol. That doesn't always go well either. So to have somebody else that's a professional fully accountable for that is great. For example, our operation, as soon as a new threat is identified, within 60 seconds of identifying that threat, we're patching your device, your smartphone, your computer, to defend against that. It's very easy. Once you identify the threat, it's almost only math in terms of defending against it. So now you can be preemptive, you can be in real time, and have much higher efficacy through a hosted version of malware. Now, as Moore's Law goes and these things proliferate and they morph faster, more artificial intelligence, more machine learning, more heuristics, another word for the future to know, which means if it looks like this and if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck, that sort of thing, right? A lot of those advanced sciences are coming to bear in hosted antivirus solutions. We're believers in them. We think they're keeping up with the threat, and we'll see how that goes in the future.
We'll go back up for another question, but first over here, your name and your field of study and year here at Embry-Riddle.
Hello, my name is Joseph. I'm a sophomore studying astronomy astrophysics, and my main question was, how much is cybercrimes costing America nationally, and is it being handled well? Like, I mean, is the status like how's like the future?
Okay, great. All right, so what is the economic cost to the country? So I remember in 2013, the Wall Street Journal had an article, and it said, you know, this cybersecurity, this cyber risk, cybercrime deal is getting to be a big deal. We think in 2013 it's going to cost the domestic economy $100 billion. That was a really big number, and everybody went, wow, it is a big deal, $100 billion, right? By 2014, Lloyd's of London had pegged that economic estimate globally at $400 billion. The following year, a company called I can't remember the name, they're out of Chicago, multinational company, pegged it at a $1 trillion number. Now Microsoft and the World Economic Forum jointly did a study. They believe the global problem by the turn of the decade is a $3 trillion economic hit globally. The impact from cybercrime, both from an economic stability and national security level, is not being handled very well at all, probably especially in the US, but certainly everywhere in the world.
I think you said that we've passed 50% in terms of crime, cybercrime related. It's gone past the 50% mark?
It did in the UK. I wrote an article in early 2017. I said cyber risk is now existential, right? You hear that word these days, existential. I remember it first got my ear when Obama said terrorism is not an existential threat. And I think when he said, you know, terrorist and Al-Qaeda was the JV, I think what he missed was the digital age, honestly. Yes, they were just a couple of sloppy warriors someplace, but they had the network. They had the network. That was the game changer that maybe wasn't fully appreciated. But yes, Mark, in early 2017, the FBI version in the UK said that over half of all crime in the UK was cyber related. So you take petty theft, bank robberies, all drug crime, anything that's a crime, put it all together, it still is, cybercrime is still greater than all of it in the aggregate.
Once again, here's Alan.
All right, we have a question from Malcolm Dryden, who is a 1986 graduate of Daytona Beach. He asks, cloud storage seems to be a huge target for data thieves. Wouldn't it be more secure for everyone to store their own data on their own devices, thereby making it harder to find?
So, sort of the reverse, right? We're experiencing where our data is being distributed to the point where it's called clouds and ether and even fog. Why wouldn't we just bring that back so that we could get our arms back around it and hold it accountable and not have these risks? I think it just goes contrary to human nature. There might be an argument that that could be safer. I think you still have to worry about theft and fire and floods and other things that can affect your data. But even if you assumed that it could be held perfectly safe, data itself, much less with the internet, wants to be liberated. It just is human nature. It is just the way civilization has always operated. Secrets and sort of hoarded information just never lasts very long.
Right over here, your question now for Brett.
Hello, my name is Jacob. I'm a junior here. My major's communications.
Jacob?
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned about Vizio being sued by the state of New Jersey
Right.
about their TVs having a camera that would continue to record conversation after the TV was turned off.
Right.
I recently read a news story about a couple weeks ago where a man claimed that when he was scrolling through his Facebook account, he saw an ad for something that he remembers talking to someone about in conversation, and he claims that Facebook may have heard it through the microphone in his smartphone and tailored the ads to what he said.
Right.
Is there any truth to that, and is that technically an invasion of privacy?
I have heard plenty of stories that sound just like that. Do I know as a fact that that's what they're doing? I don't know. I also know some things where you think you've connected the dots and you make an assumption based on those connecting of the dots. There are a lot of other dots that you might not be aware of. For example, there's now a kind of a famous story of a father that while he's at home, he starts getting all these coupons in the mail and junk mail for discounts on diapers and baby food. And he's got a 17-year-old daughter in the home. And so he started to look into it a little bit more. Well, CVS had figured out his daughter was pregnant because of her activities in the aisle. Monitoring her activities in the aisle as a consumer, and just reversed engineered that information to further market into the home for more sales.
Creepy.
So he found out his daughter was pregnant through CVS. So my point is there are a lot of dots out there, and sometimes we might presume they're being connected in one way when they might be connected in another way.
That's creepy. We have a question from over here. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you. My name is Chase.
Right into the microphone.
I'm a sophomore here, and I was curious what you think net neutrality's role plays in all of this.
Net neutrality? Ready for that? Who's Jerry Kenny? That's
Dr.
your
Kessler.
big thing. Go ahead.
Net neutrality. Honestly, I feel like I should defer to Dr. Kessler. He's really much more of an expert than I am. Maybe, Dr. Kessler, you want to give a couple of words on net
Remind you, you're
neutrality?
still under oath. If you want to step up.
Dr. Kessler actually wrote an article for my company on net neutrality.
That's the only reason you're having me come back here. My cut is that net neutrality is the reason that we have the internet that we have today. I look at one example, you mentioned Facebook. I think if we did not have net neutrality, we would not have the Facebook that we have today, because MySpace would have made sure that they never saw the light of day. I believe that net neutrality is essential so that people who have good ideas can get to the internet to market those ideas and share those ideas, which is the exact way that the TCP/IP protocol suite was made to work. People would have a new idea. They would say, well, let's see if I can get this to work. And all they needed were other people that could come up with independent implementations of that good idea, of that good application. And all of a sudden, you now had an internet standard, which people had a choice to use or not use. If we don't have net neutrality, the internet service providers are going to have a lot of say as to where we can get to quickly and where we can get to slowly. And the nature of people is, I'm going to go where I can get to fast. And I'm not going to go to the places that I can't get to fast. And so we will have people on the low end of the market who can't afford to buy their way in, who will not be able to get in.
Wow. Brad, I'm having one of those moments where you think you heard something, but you're not sure, and I'm thinking, did I dream this, or did somebody say this? That recently, the Amazon Alexa, was used in a commercial. Right. And when they called out Alexa, anyone who had a television on, it activated their Alexa that was in the room and sent a signal as to how many people were watching the game. I don't know, is this Amazon trying to measure if their commercial was effective by how many viewers participated? Can you explain that? Because that is so wild. It's like three-dimensional advertising.
Yeah. So, a lot of important information is collected around who is watching what. That's how they sell advertising, and that's how the industry of marketing is made. Well, it's really hard now with the internet. We're constantly changing channels and fast-forwarding through commercials, and so the value of that information, or the ability to put accurate information together, is harder and harder. So here on a football game, there's an Amazon advertisement for Alexa, the personal assistant unit. And they know that when they say the name, if a watcher has an Alexa unit, it will spark up, it'll go on. and maybe even answer the question. So that is instant information. How many people are watching the game right now at this moment? That's very valuable data. It might also be used by Amazon to see how many people are actually watching the advertisement. How do they respond to that advertisement? And again, this is data that from a marketing standpoint, data is the new oil. They'll get it however they can. They'll mine it however they can get it.
A little bit about your business now. Who's calling you? Who calls your company? Is it private individuals? Is it companies? Is it international governments? Who calls you?
So it's been such an interesting observation over the years to see. Now, remember that when I started the business, we wanted to come way down the food chain. Almost 99% plus of our customers have never bought cybersecurity solutions before. In a lot of cases, they weren't even thinking about it until I got in front of them. So they're new customers to the industry. They are newly aware, they're new demand, they're new users of this technology. We don't sell necessarily into IT departments. We don't sell necessarily into Fortune 100 companies. We spend more time in the living room than we do the boardroom. However, because of such everyday experience, real world experience, where the rubber hits the road at the intersection of people, their personal technology, and risk, and all this experiential knowledge and insights that we're gaining as a result of that, we are being pulled upstream by large enterprises and Fortune 100 companies, because you know what? Their employees are us. And they're realizing, the IT department can only do so much. We need culturally, this is a governance committee issue now, we need culturally to create adaptation and change. And how do you get people to think, and how do you influence them to change? We probably have as much experience at doing that as anybody. So who's calling us? Anywhere from, we have a great demographic that's 65 years old plus. People don't want to be bullied, they don't want to be a victim, and they don't want to give up their technology. They're not going to give up. We see great resilience out there. I'm really impressed with that. So they tend to be educated, they tend to be informed, they tend to have investments, that's our demographic, and they tend to be maybe 45 years old on up. But recently, in the last 6 to 12 months, we've been getting calls from the C-suite, large enterprises, wanting to understand what we're learning.
Part of our audience is made up of fledgling students who might wonder if this is a growing field. Cybersecurity, will it be one of the faster growing sectors of the economy?
Yes, I think globally and domestically, and I think everything you read would speak to that, there's not near the workforce. Companies can't pay people enough to stay. They're losing employees all the time. I think that's one of the reasons why, our vendors that we contract with to provide our solutions to everyday people are not marketing to you. Right? They're marketing to the IT department and to the government and to the Fortune 100 company, because that's about all the business they can handle. So we try to act as a facilitator to get their products and solutions more broadly distributed.
We're coming over here now for a second bite of the apple. Your question.
You mentioned a couple times artificial intelligence, and I know there's been a lot of controversy with the rise of its ability to solve incredibly complex problems. And I was just wondering how, in your opinion, does that affect cybersecurity in general, or does it, in fact?
It does affect, and it's a double-edged sword. That is, it empowers the hackers, but also increases efficacy of the protection. But hackers tend to uptake new technology and use that new technology much faster than the average consumer. So the advantage will be theirs for some period of time.
Let's go up to Alan Pratt, who has a question from our worldwide audience.
Another question from Scott, alumnus from Embry-Riddle. How do you convince companies, especially as they have access to more and more personal data, to take cybersecurity seriously instead of waiting for a breach to happen before getting a security budget?
Boy, that's the question of the day. And it's a very frustrating situation because you see the headlines. Equifax stock, I think, went down by $7 billion in a day. So the consequences are there. The CEO's gone. So people are losing their jobs. Shareholders are getting killed. and yet we still have a CEO that gets in front of Congress and says, I don't know if your data is encrypted or not. And if they weren't, not able to answer the question, they blamed it on the Russians, sort of thing. You don't really hear anything that's tremendously reassuring that tells us people are starting to get it, and they're starting to get it in a way that applies to what the problem is today, not just speaking to maybe what the problem was yesterday.
Dr. Philip Kroeger works alongside Dr. Gary Kessler and educated us on the IRS. Those people, we spoke of this earlier, people filing their taxes and suddenly finding they've been filed for them.
Right.
And I asked you, is the IRS operating under an old 19th century type of technology and system that makes them vulnerable to these thefts?
Yes.
Wow.
Most of the federal government is, very much so.
These are the people entrusted to protect us. How about that, Apples? Scary.
And really the message is that you can't leave it to the government, you can't leave it to law enforcement, you can't leave it to the IT department. It is an existential risk, and it really is an individual issue that starts with the home and family and as individuals to themselves.
We will take questions too from the general public in addition to the students. If you all sitting here have a question, please step up to our microphone. The medical industry as it relates to HIPAA and security.
Yeah.
This is a mess.
Yes.
And the hospitals are caught neatly in the middle. Physicians and doctors cannot reveal what they know.
Right.
But if people are coming in the back door stealing that information and using it for nefarious reasons, is it likely that the hospitals and the doctors could be held responsible for not having the latest protection of that information?
Yes, and we're beginning to see that. The HIPAA laws that were revised in late 2013 not only became much broader in their scope, but much deeper in terms of their consequences. Now, they are not necessarily applying the law as, to the letter of the law, but we are beginning to see some instances. We had a new customer out of Houston, doctor, who left a laptop in his convertible. The laptop was stolen, and his HIPAA fine was $2.5 million.
Oh, my.
Yeah. So there are big teeth, and they're approaching it in a lot of different ways, but it is not necessarily enforced. The HIPAA laws say that if you have any access to health records, personal health records, anywhere in the environment, that you are under HIPAA regulations. That means if you're a janitor or you have a janitorial service and you're cleaning up a HIPAA-regulated environment, you too, in your business and your operation, must be HIPAA compliant. I will tell you, none of them are.
This, not to make people paranoid, but I think of public safety, water, electricity. We
Right.
spoke earlier of EMP threats in
Right.
this country. But let me talk about like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which controls an extraordinary amount of water for 6 states, and then their footprint is wide. Is there a worry, Brad, that someone could hack into that system from the outside and change the chemical composition of water, affect the drinking water or the power that's delivered to people? Is that too science fiction-y, or is that a real threat?
It's a very real threat. And the first instance of that, which is really sort of the harbinger to all of it, was something called Stuxnet. Maybe you're familiar with it, where domestically our intelligence determined how to hack Iraqi nuclear plants. And they did that by hacking a device, a very small device that was one very small component of the nuclear operation. I think it was made by Siemens, as a matter of fact. And just because they were able to hack that one small component of this overall very large operation, they were able to reduce or limit the progress that the Iraqis were making. Well, that applies to any major infrastructure, whether it be TVA or ATC or any others. Every one of those elements, and Dr. Kessler speaks to the security of systems, right? We talk about the security of this and we talk about the security of that. We don't necessarily think about the security of an overall system. And we still have a long way to go, so I would tell you that's absolutely a very real threat. And we will see it. and we will see it happen, and it'll be more than once. And there have been nuclear plants hacked in other places in the world, and there have been real cyber Armageddon type events other places in the world. And our foes, World War III will start with a mouse click. The history of nations is the history of weapons, and cyber warfare is now the weapon of choice. It belongs in line with the longbow and gunpowder and ICBMs, for that matter.
In light of the president's trip to Asia, where he talked with officials from China, he also meets with Russians, we're wondering, what's he thinking, not to go too political on you here, as he looks to Putin and wonders if they're hacking, did they have an impression on our election? You've been asked this, I know, across the country. Is it possible that foreign countries could, through cyber hacking, interfere with an election in the United States?
Yes, and I think it's silly to believe that it didn't happen, or that the Russians and many, many others were not meddling or trying really hard to meddle. I think that that's incredibly naive.
So it's possible for them to what? Interfere with a voting device or the tabulation of such, the spreading of propaganda? We learned from James Woolsey from the CIA, who was here a couple of weeks ago, there are more people doing misinformation in Russia than actually serve in the armed forces. Crazy thought, but he said it's true.
Right. Right. And so I think, to James Clapper's point, they're not only just aiming at the TVA and the large infrastructure, but they're aiming in volume at society and civilization in general, because they can, and because of the tremendous, if they just want to create pandemonium.
Okay, I'm wondering about this. We were just days away from the anniversary of the great blackout, I think, of 1964 in New York. That was a failure.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about an attack, but we're wondering about cyber failure.
Right.
Are we better than we were, much better than we were 50 years ago in terms of being able to not have a failure because we just are antiquated? We've been speaking a lot tonight about attacks, but what about our own failures because we don't have updated systems?
The internet was built to be incredibly redundant. So an ICBM or anything else could take out a major portion of the internet, and the internet would still operate and survive. And that very basic element of design, I think, holds true today and makes it incredibly resilient. So I think there can be I don't think anybody could take out the entire internet and bring it all to its knees. There could be broad swaths of activity, but I don't know that it could be more than that.
A couple of years ago, one of the builders in our community talked about an ongoing series of thefts of appliances from model houses being built in the community. What they then decided to do was put GPS on stoves, refrigerators, microwave ovens, so if the bad guys did break in and steal them, they'd be able to be found quickly. This is the question. Is this an ongoing thing that we're just starting to find out may be existing, that manufacturers are putting these microwavable, or they're putting chips in devices to, I guess, determine what time of day do we use them, how long do we use them, what do we use them for, and we're unaware of this?
Yeah, that's essentially what the Internet of Things is.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, you can actually buy cables now that have GPSs built into them. So you might be suspicious and be looking on your laptop to be sure nobody's spying or tracking on you, but you didn't think to check the cable.
The cable?
The cable.
Wow. How many people knew this?
All right.
Okay, one more sweep around the room before we have an intimate crowd here tonight. If you have a question watching us on YouTube, please put that question to Alan right away. We'll get that answered. And anyone in the audience that may have a question, we simply want you to be on record so that you can step up to the microphone. Send us some concluding thoughts from you.
Sure.
Where is the next thing that viewers should be watching that could be a challenge with the internet as it affects their daily lives? We've talked about the monetary aspect of it, security. Is it security in their home? And the reason I mention this is we did a story a couple of weeks ago that some company wants to do home delivery, but here's how it's going to work. They're testing it in California. They'll come into your home, they'll bring the groceries or whatever it is you bought, put it in your refrigerator, mind you,
right,
and leave. And I think this has got legal disaster all over it. It's from the movie Who Stole My Cheese?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
What about things like that?
Yeah. I think we're going to have to keep an eye on all of those things, but I think there's something that's more predominant and more at hand today and will really ramp up quickly in a big way, like in the immediate future, and that's hacking over public Wi-Fi systems. It's very easy with a very inexpensive device to sniff, it's a technical term, to sniff the Wi-Fi airwaves in Starbucks or the hotel or wherever you happen to be connected on your Wi-Fi, and essentially watch everything that you're doing over those communications. I would say that's the evolution of pickpocketing. These days, you don't have to steal somebody's purse or wallet or identification physically. You can do it digitally without ever touching them and without them ever knowing until well after the fact that they've been harmed in some way. And again, there's not much scene of the crime. People don't realize they've been electronically pickpocketed until sometime later. And so that profit motive is driven down all the way to the basic element of a street criminal. And so much of crime now is converging with cybercrime, the traditional crimes of the world, whether it be pickpocketing or extortion or blackmail or whatever they've been over the eons of humanity, are now finding their digital application in hacking of the Wi-Fi airwaves, I think, is one that people are not near aware of that they need to be.
Finally, and you've been very gracious in answering all of these questions, if folks want to learn more about what your firm does or would like to follow up for individual consultation, what's the best way for them to do that with Total Digital Security?
The best way is to find us on the internet, our website. Imagine that, right? Just go to the cloud, find Total Digital Security, that's 3 words, totaldigitalsecurity.com. And we publish a lot of, I think, really good information that is about us and our daily interaction with our technology and how we can be a lot smarter about that and defend ourselves. And we hope that it's empowering. A lot of this stuff is scary, but we don't lead with fear. We really lead with empowerment because there are answers. And honestly, the crime is so rampant that if all you do is come down off the radar by this much, because you're not Hillary Clinton or Colin Powell, we're not being targeted, we just have to get off the radar a little bit. It's kind of like if we're the only house on the street that is locking our door and has a fence and a Doberman, and every other house has the front door wide open, the bad guy's probably going to pass our house. And so that's why we invite you to visit our site at totaldigitalsecurity.com and see what some of these measures are that you can take yourself.
Now, we didn't touch upon this. We were supposed to talk about it last week, and our guest could not make it to Daytona Beach. But many of the folks watching us travel by air. Yes. I'll be traveling by air myself in the next few months, and I guess the question is, how safe are we in the air against somebody trying to take out a plane or land it prematurely? How are we?
So I think you're in a state of much higher risk when you're behind the keyboard than you are in the cockpit or sitting on the airplane, for that matter. I don't think there's much risk to that. I think there is risk of information loss. It's easy to do. So the risk is not necessarily, I think, of the airplane going down. It's just being very conscious of what you do on a public network if you're not using a VPN or encryption or something else to protect yourself.
I want to thank our Office of Alumni Relations for putting this thing together tonight. We hope that you've enjoyed watching on YouTube, and I want to thank Brad as well as Alan Pratt for working with us tonight, Tony Petro, Bob Score, Patrick and Evan, who helped in addition putting this together. Before you go, let's tell folks what's going to be happening when we come back tomorrow night. An evening with Major General Linda Sine. This lady is very interesting because not only did she have to overcome adversity herself, she speaks to the issue that has been very much in the news about sexual harassment and impropriety. This woman has spoke out about this. She's a remarkable study in doing the right thing, and she can offer insight into the trouble that was in Maryland as she was the head of the National Guard and dealt directly with the governor during some of the troubled times that they had recently. That's tomorrow night. Then we conclude our fall series on Monday night with an old friend of Embry-Riddle's, CBS newsman Bob Schieffer, the former host of Face the Nation, will be here to talk about his book, Overload. We're expecting a full house for that. We invite you to get here early. Bob will be signing copies of his book, so everyone gets a chance to meet Bob Schieffer. A remarkable journey. He was with us 17 years ago, 2 days before the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. Bob was in Dallas working for the Fort Worth Telegraph that day and tells us who got in the car with he and another reporter. I think you'll find the story very intriguing. That's coming up next Monday night here at Embry-Riddle in the Speaker Series. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight and being with us. A round of applause for Brad Deflin.
Thank you.
Thank you and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Mark.